April 16, 1945, dawn broke not with light, but with fire. From the east, Soviet artillery unleashed a barrage so deafening that windows rattled hundreds of miles away. The Oder River marked the last line before Berlin, and now the Red Army was crossing it with an onslaught unlike anything Europe had seen. The capital of the Reich trembled as its final chapter began. In the shadows of an air raid shelter, a young German woman sat among the dust and sweat of her comrades. Her uniform was creased, her hands trembling, her rifle gripped as if it might anchor her to sanity. She did not clutch it from faith in victory. That illusion had long since died, but because orders demanded it. Overhead, the ceiling groaned with each Soviet shell. Dust fell like ash, mingling with the acrid smoke of oil fires burning in the streets above. Berlin was collapsing. Above ground, women were no longer hidden away as spectators. They were auxiliaries in Wehrmacht offices, manning typewriters one week and anti-aircraft guns the next. They were Volkssturm conscripts, teenagers and mothers, alike handed rifles and told to stand against the tide. They were Red Cross nurses who stitched wounds in candlelight, carrying water across rubble-strewn courtyards, whispering prayers for patients they knew would not live until morning. The city had become a battlefield, without front lines. Trams lay overturned on Wilhelmstrasse. The spree ran red with spilled fuel and debris. Civilians trudged through the ruins, clutching suitcases and children. Every corner of the city echoed with the paradox of the hour. Women, once confined to kitchens and classrooms, were now pressed into the very heart of Germany's doomed defense. One nurse, Anna, remembered standing at the entrance to a shattered hospital. The ground shook, she whispered later in testimony. The sky was burning, and they brought in boys with bandages where faces should have been. I sewed with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I told one boy he would live. I knew it was a lie. Her words carried the weight of countless others, fragments of lives where silence was often the only resistance left. In a schoolyard, now converted to a Volkssturm assembly point, women, lined up with men decades older, rifles slung awkwardly over thin shoulders. A commander barked that Berlin would not fall, even as the thunder of Soviet Katyushas answered him in the distance. One woman whispered to the man beside her, "This is madness." He replied with eyes hollow from hunger, "Madness is all we have left." Every street became a corridor of fear. Every knock at the door might be the Gestapo, enforcing discipline on those too weary to fight. Yet fear of the Soviets, driven by tales of retribution, compelled many to obey. In this crucible, women bore the dual burden of expectation and survival. To heal, to fight, to endure, even when the war was already lost. Berlin's fall was not merely a military collapse. It was the unraveling of ideology, the disintegration of myths that had bound a nation. Women who had once been told their role was in Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, now shouldered rifles, bandages, and burdens no propaganda poster had ever dared to imagine. As the artillery roared louder, the young woman in the shelter rose to her feet. Her rifle felt impossibly heavy, her breath unsteady. The order came to move toward the surface, toward a city already consumed by flames. She stepped into the choking smoke of Wilhelmstrasse, into the ruins of a Reich that demanded her sacrifice in its final hours. Her story was not unique. It was the story of thousands swallowed by silence, remembered only in fragments of diaries, in testimonies recorded decades later, in the whispers of history too long ignored. The ashes of Berlin did not only mark the fall of a regime. They marked the moment when ordinary women, once invisible to history, became unwilling soldiers in a war that had already ended. Only no one had told them yet. In the first years of the war, the Reich insisted that women's duty was not on the battlefield, but in the home. The mantra of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, echoed from propaganda posters, radio speeches, and the pages of women's magazines. Their purpose, the regime declared, was to bear sons for the Führer, cook for the family, and keep faith with tradition. Yet, as the Wehrmacht swept across Poland in 1939 and deeper into Europe in 1940, that ideal began to fracture. Total war demanded more than slogans. By 1941, the German Red Cross had transformed into a training ground for frontline service. Women who had once been midwives or village nurses were drilled in triage medicine, amputation support, and battlefield evacuation. Training manuals instructed them in how to splint shattered limbs with sticks, disinfect wounds in barns, and keep soldiers alive long enough to be carried from the front. Many were barely out of school when they found themselves performing surgery by lantern light, whispering to men twice their age who begged for morphine they no longer had. Parallel to them were the auxiliaries, the Helferinnen. Officially, they were assistants, clerks, typists, switchboard operators. Unofficially, they became the nervous system of the German war machine. A 20-year-old secretary might sit at a typewriter in a Luftwaffe bunker, relaying orders that directed fighter squadrons into combat. A young radio operator in occupied France transmitted encrypted signals that shifted divisions across the continent. Propaganda called them helpers of the heroes. In reality, their work carried the same weight as the soldiers' rifles. Some roles pushed even further. Anti-aircraft batteries, once manned by seasoned artillerymen, soon included girls barely out of adolescence. Positioned on the rooftops of Hamburg and Berlin, they tracked Allied bombers through the searchlights, loading heavy shells into flak guns as the sky burned. For many, it was the first time they realized that the Reich had transformed them from daughters into combatants, even as it denied them the title of soldier. Orders blurred with necessity. A young woman named Liesel later recalled being told she would be assigned as a clerk. Within weeks, she was handed a headset and trained to direct artillery fire. They told us we were still only helpers, she remembered. But the orders we sent killed men. We knew it. Her voice carried the quiet tension of thousands like her. Women who stood at the threshold between ideology and reality, forced to reconcile propaganda with practice. The contradictions deepened. While Nazi speeches proclaimed that the German woman's battlefield was motherhood, the Reich quietly issued mobilization decrees, drafting tens of thousands into auxiliary service. Posters showed smiling nurses tending to grateful soldiers, yet diaries tell of exhaustion, hunger, and the relentless pressure of duty. Women marched in step, wore uniforms, and saluted, but their service was often hidden behind euphemisms that stripped it of recognition. This integration was not a matter of choice. Many were compelled by labor laws, others by the weight of expectation. In a society where refusal could mean denunciation, for those who complied, the transition was swift. Civilian life vanished overnight. One week, they baked bread in kitchens. The next, they were handling field radios in bunkers. The war machine had consumed them, and the line between civilian and combatant all but disappeared. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa began, and the Eastern Front demanded more bodies than Germany could supply, the Reich's reliance on women became undeniable. Red Cross nurses rode eastward on overcrowded hospital trains. Female auxiliaries tracked troop movements as millions marched into the Soviet Union. Behind every officer's command stood an unseen cadre of women, whose signatures, transmissions, and bandages made the war possible. The transformation was complete. What began as ideals of hearth and home had given way to orders, uniforms, and guns. Women had been drawn not by choice, but by necessity into a conflict that would soon consume them alongside the soldiers they served. And as the war expanded, their service would no longer be confined to offices or hospitals. Soon, they would stand, directly in the path of fire, behind enemy lines, and in the ruins of collapsing cities. By the autumn of 1944, the war had shifted onto German soil. The Allied armies pressed through France, crossed Belgium, and advanced toward the fortified Siegfried Line. For the women stationed in western Germany, around Aachen, Cologne, and the Ruhr Valley, the war no longer rumbled at a distance. It arrived in walls collapsing, in skies torn open by Allied bombers, in the thunder of artillery that shook the very ground beneath them. In makeshift hospitals, nurses stitched torn flesh by lantern light, their hands trembling as plaster rained from ceilings. Wards collapsed into rubble, as incendiary bombs turned once sterile halls into infernos. One diary from a Cologne nurse described working through the night with blood on every sheet, no more morphine, and the roof groaning above us. Each time the air raid siren wailed, she faced the same decision: continue sewing wounds or run for the shelter. Most stayed. Patience came before safety. Auxiliaries, once told their role was clerical, now carried ammunition to frontline units faltering under the Allied onslaught. In Aachen, young women heaved crates of shells through shattered streets, their uniforms smudged with ash. Others were ordered to escort children out of burning neighborhoods, leading them past rows of corpses and the smell of gasoline fires. They were told they were support, but each moment placed them in the direct path of destruction. For many, the terror was constant. Nights were broken by the drone of bombers overhead, followed by the crescendo of explosions that rattled windows and splintered doors. Entire city blocks vanished in firestorms, and women tasked with maintaining order found themselves digging survivors out with bare hands. Diaries and letters home reflected not triumph, but exhaustion. "I no longer dream of peace," one wrote, "only of silence." The paradox grew sharper. Propaganda continued to paint them as loyal guardians of the Reich, yet their lived reality was indistinguishable from the soldiers they were told they only served. They wore uniforms, they followed orders, and they bled under fire. In Cologne, a group of auxiliaries trapped in a collapsing bunker scrawled their names onto scraps of paper, leaving them in their pockets so families might one day know what had happened. Amid the terror, there were moments of grim solidarity. Nurses shielded patients with their own bodies during bombings. Clerks crawled into wreckage to pull comrades out. A Red Cross volunteer remembered holding the hand of a dying soldier who whispered, "Don't let them forget us." She never knew his name, only that her uniform, once a symbol of care, had become as much a target as his. By the winter of 1944, as the Allies pushed through the Ardennes and toward the Rhine, women across the Western Front had become unwilling witnesses to the Reich's collapse. Their diaries captured the dissonance. Orders demanded resilience, but the walls shook with every shell, and their voices were drowned in the roar of collapsing cities. This chapter of silence and fire revealed the truth behind the uniforms, that women once consigned to the margins were now at the very center of Germany's destruction. They endured not as passive supporters, but as frontline witnesses to a war tearing their nation apart. By the winter of 1944, the Reich demanded what it could no longer enforce: absolute loyalty. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Cologne and Dresden, while Soviet tanks pressed toward the Oder. In streets littered with rubble, the Nazi regime called upon women not as mothers or workers, but as the last defenders of a dying empire. Some answered. Teenage auxiliaries climbed into flak towers, their hands blistered as they loaded shells into anti-aircraft guns. In propaganda films, their faces were cast as symbols of defiance. German girls, standing firm against the storm. But away from the camera, diaries revealed their fear. One 19-year-old gunner wrote, "I shut my eyes each time I fired. I could not see the planes, only hear the thunder." Others resisted quietly, their loyalty unraveling under the weight of survival. Nurses in field hospitals rationed morphine not by rank but by need, defying orders to prioritize wounded officers over civilians. Housewives slipped bread to half-starved POWs marched through the streets. A Red Cross volunteer in Munich confessed to smuggling iodine to a captured Soviet soldier, whispering, "If they see me, I die too." The fracture widened as Volkssturm militias, a desperate force of old men and young boys, marched women into defensive roles. In some towns, women carried rifles beside them, while others hid in basements, refusing to obey. Propaganda officers screamed for sacrifice, painting desertion as treason. Yet each new artillery strike hollowed the meaning of those words. When entire neighborhoods lay in ashes, loyalty became an echo, shouted from collapsing podiums. Still, loyalty carried a dangerous weight. Some women clung to it with fervor, believing defiance meant dishonor. Female auxiliaries remained at their posts until Allied troops arrived, some captured in uniform and branded as combatants. Others stayed in collapsing hospitals, shielding patients with their own bodies when bombs struck. "My oath bound me," one nurse recalled years later, "even when the Reich was only smoke." But just as many chose compassion over command. Farmers' daughters hid Jewish children in barns. Secretaries falsified records to keep neighbors off deportation lists. In the ruins of Königsberg, a widow gathered terrified orphans and walked them westward, past retreating Wehrmacht units who no longer cared to ask where she came from. These were not acts of organized resistance, but fragments of defiance, born in the cracks where ideology collapsed under humanity. The paradox was inescapable. Women raised in obedience, molded by years of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, and swastika banners, now stood at a crossroads where loyalty could mean complicity, and defiance could mean death. Each choice left scars. Some lived with the silence of what they had witnessed, but could not stop. Others carried the guilt of obedience long after the Reich had fallen. As Berlin burned and surrender loomed, the cries of propaganda were drowned by the thunder of Allied shells. For the women caught between loyalty and collapse, the war became not a matter of ideology, but of survival, of conscience, of choosing between orders and mercy when both could end in ruin. The winter of 1945 carved its scars across the Rhineland and Bavaria. As Allied columns advanced through shattered towns, they gathered not only Wehrmacht soldiers, but also women in gray-green uniforms, secretaries, nurses, signal operators, and auxiliaries, all now marched in step, stripped of rank, reduced to prisoners of war. Along the cobblestones of liberated villages, civilians lined the streets. Some hurled stones, others spat or jeered. For women who had once walked proudly in service of the Reich, humiliation became their new uniform. "We were soldiers one day, prisoners the next," one diary recorded, her words trembling with disbelief. Their boots echoed against the ruins, while the stars and stripes fluttered above convoys that would carry them into captivity. In U.S.-run POW camps, fences of barbed wire replaced the crumbling walls of Germany's collapsing front. American interrogators faced a dilemma. Were these women harmless clerks or accomplices in Nazi crimes? The line was impossible to draw. Uniforms branded them all alike, cogs in Hitler's machine. Women who had spent nights tending fevers or translating reports now found themselves questioned under bright lamps, their words measured against suspicion. For many, the paradox was unbearable. Nurses insisted they had healed indiscriminately. Soldiers, civilians, sometimes even captured enemies. Yet records tied their units to campaigns scarred by atrocities. A radio operator remembered the moment her interrogator leaned close and asked, "Were you transmitting orders for the SS or for the wounded?" She could not prove her innocence. She could only insist, "I did what they told me." Inside the wire, life was suspended between shame and survival. Food was sparse but steady. White bread and canned meat. A bitter reminder of plenty denied to their countrymen. Nights were filled with whispered prayers and unanswered questions. Would they be released, tried, sent back to a homeland in ruins? The camps became places of haunting reflection. Some women felt relief, spared the destruction of the front lines. Others drowned in guilt, accused by fellow prisoners of collaboration, or mocked by guards as symbols of a defeated enemy. One nurse recalled seeing American medics treating German POWs with the same care she had once given, and she wept silently. They showed us the mercy we had been told to deny. Outside the barbed wire, the war thundered toward its end. Inside, the women confronted an identity crisis. To the victors, they were enemies. To their own people, they were forgotten. And to themselves, they were caught between roles. Caregivers branded as soldiers, auxiliaries remembered as accomplices. Their captivity under the stars and stripes illuminated the cruel ambiguity of total war. These women had lived in gray zones where service blurred with complicity and survival blurred with guilt. Now, under foreign skies, they waited, not knowing whether history would remember them as villains, victims, or simply as women trapped in uniforms they had never truly chosen. The guns had fallen silent, but silence did not mean peace. In the ruined cities of Germany, women who had worn uniforms returned home not as veterans, but as ghosts of a war no one wished to remember. For Allied nurses, medals and parades awaited. For resistance fighters, monuments and songs were raised. But for the women who had carried rifles in the Volkssturm, who had manned flak batteries, who had stitched wounds beneath burning rafters, there was only the heavy curtain of shame. Neighbors looked away. Families seldom asked. The Third Reich's crimes had poisoned every act of service. To speak of duty was to invite suspicion. To speak of suffering was to risk contempt. Many chose silence. Their diaries, folded into drawers, became their only confession. In one entry, a nurse described carrying a wounded soldier through the firestorm of Dresden, her uniform singed to ash. "I told him he would live," she wrote, "even though I knew he would not." The paradox was cruel. These women had endured the same shell fire, the same hunger, the same terror as the men who fought beside them. Yet history recorded them only in shadows. Unnamed auxiliaries, faceless clerks, forgotten nurses. Their deeds, however human, were drowned beneath the weight of generals' strategies, SS atrocities, and the mythology of a male-only battlefield. Even decades later, interviews revealed the sting of dismissal. One former radio operator recalled her interrogation after the war. "They said I was not a soldier," she remembered, "but I had worn the uniform. I had buried comrades. I had lived through bombardments. If that is not a soldier, what is it? What silenced them was not only defeat, but also gender. The Nazi state had insisted their purpose was Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. To admit that women had fought, suffered, and bled at the front was to unravel the regime's carefully crafted image. After 1945, both victors and the defeated had reason to erase that truth. For the Allies, remembering German women as combatants blurred the narrative of liberation. For Germany itself, still reeling from guilt, their stories were inconvenient echoes of complicity. Yet the record survives, fragile but unbroken. Archives preserve reports of nurses improvising surgeries in candlelit basements, of auxiliaries smuggling food to children beneath collapsing bridges, of women walking for miles with wounded men on their backs. Oral testimonies capture the weary dignity of survivors who knew that no medals would ever adorn their silence. The shadows they left are not empty. They reveal courage that defied circumstance, humanity that persisted amid ruin, and choices that bore the weight of life and death. These women were not celebrated, but their endurance carved a legacy that history can no longer ignore. For in the rubble of Berlin, Cologne, and Königsberg, they had chosen, sometimes against orders, sometimes against hope, to preserve life in a world intent on destroying it. Their memory, long hidden in silence, now emerges not as a monument of stone, but as a whisper of truth. That even in the darkest collapse, women bore the burden of war and carried it alone into the shadows of memory. She stood in the ruins of a cratered field, her uniform torn, boots heavy with mud, staring into the silence that followed collapse. No victory banners waved, no commanders barked orders, only the sound of wind threading through burned-out trees and the distant cries of displaced families marked the moment. For countless women on Germany's collapsing front, this was the war's final image. Not triumph, but silence. Their legacy was paradoxical. They were not granted the full status of soldiers, nor spared as mere civilians. They existed in the in-between. Defenders pressed into battle, nurses who risked infection and fire to save the wounded, auxiliaries who manned radio posts until the walls caved in. They carried ammunition and bandages in equal measure. They were healers and reluctant witnesses, fighting not for ideology, but for survival in a world tearing itself apart. Yet their names rarely entered history books. They were remembered not in military rolls or national parades, but in faded diaries and whispered testimonies. A nurse's trembling handwriting captured the night she stitched wounds by candlelight, while the ceiling cracked above her. An auxiliary's diary described watching the flames of Cologne rise against the night sky, asking quietly if the world would ever believe she had been there. Their memorial was not carved in bronze or raised in marble. It lived in the lives they saved. A child smuggled out of a burning city, a wounded soldier who limped home because someone refused to let him bleed out in the mud, a prisoner who found a crust of bread in his hands when none should have been spared. Small acts of endurance, unrecorded yet immeasurable, became their true monuments. The silence that followed the war deepened their erasure. Returning home, many hid their uniforms or burned them outright, fearing suspicion, shame, or the accusation of complicity. When they spoke, their words were often met with dismissal. It was nothing. You were only helping. Yet the record tells otherwise. These women bore witness to the Reich's final collapse, their bodies and minds marked by the same hunger, fire, and bombardment as the soldiers who stood beside them. Their story ends not in applause, but in quiet departure. Cinematic in its starkness, the closing image lingers. Women walking away from burning cities, carrying what little they had, their faces lit by the glow of destruction behind them. Some led children by the hand, others walked alone, heads lowered, carrying invisible burdens. None expected statues. Few imagined their voices would echo decades later. But history is not only written in medals or official records, it is preserved in the fragments they left behind. Scattered letters, fading photographs, half-told memories passed to children and grandchildren. Through them, the forgotten fight of women soldiers emerges again, not as myth, but as memory. Their legacy is both fire and silence. Fire in the courage that pushed them through the collapse, silence in the way history turned its face away. And yet, in every whispered diary, in every untold act of compassion, their endurance survives. Not as conquerors, not as heroes, but as reminders that even in the darkest twilight of war, women carried the weight of survival, and carried it quietly into history. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was louder than any artillery barrage. Across Germany's shattered cities and smoking ruins, women who had carried the war on their backs found themselves erased from the story. No medals pinned to their uniforms, no speeches offered in their honor. They returned not as heroes, but as shadows, their contributions fading into the rubble alongside the buildings they had once defended. Their fight had never been with rifles or tanks. It had been waged with bandages pressed to open wounds, with radio dials carefully turned under blackout curtains, with the steady hands that carried children through firestorms. It was a war of endurance, fought against hunger, exhaustion, and despair. Where armies clashed in steel, women resisted in silence. And that silence became their battlefield. Diaries, often hidden under floorboards or carried in the folds of a uniform, whispered the truth that history ignored. A Red Cross nurse in Cologne wrote of stitching torn bodies by lantern light as bombs collapsed the hospital walls. An auxiliary recorded the moment she marched into captivity, writing simply, "Yesterday we served. Today we are prisoners." These voices, fragile yet unbroken, carried the dignity of those who had no parades waiting for them. The paradox of their struggle was clear. They were never fully soldiers, yet never merely civilians. They were both participants and victims, both actors in the Reich's collapse and survivors of its downfall. Their legacy did not live in monuments or state ceremonies. It lived in endurance, the quiet survival of those who bore witness when the world fell apart. The closing image lingers. Women walking away from burning cities, uniforms torn, belongings scarce, their silhouettes fading into the smoke. They carried no banners of victory, only the memory of what they had endured. Their fight was forgotten by history books, yet preserved in the endurance of life itself. The forgotten fight was never about conquest. It was about survival. Survival written not in headlines, but in whispers. Whispers that still echo, reminding us that dignity can exist even in defeat, and that courage does not always march in step, but sometimes walks quietly through fire.